People April is Beatle April. This month on BookTube, it's People April, a reading event dedicated to books about real people. So my pick for this month was John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs, which is a non-fiction book about the Beatles. It was written by Ian Leslie and published in 2025, and it focuses on the friendship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. If, like me, you're already a fan of the Beatles, then the broad strokes of this book will be pretty familiar. It covers John and Paul's childhoods and their kind of troubled upbringings. They both lost their mothers at a young age, and that had a profound effect on each of them, and I think was partly it was part of the bond between them, I think, as well. They each understood their other's pain in a way that a lot of the other people around them didn't really get. So it covers John and Paul meeting when they were teenagers, and Paul joining John's skiffle band, the Quarrymen, later being joined by George Harrison and kind of gradually morphing into the Beatles. It covers John and Paul making their first attempts of songwriting together as teenagers, and the inherent intimacy of creative collaboration, the vulnerability involved in sharing their unformed ideas and helping each other to turn them into finished songs. It then goes on to talk about their time gigging in Hamburg before they were famous, and how they kind of honed their stage persona. And then, of course, their rise to superstardom, the unprecedented phenomena of Beatlemania, and yeah, the entire Beatles career, and up to the unexpected, tragic, senseless murder of John Lennon in 1980. So all of that sounds like fairly standard Beatle biography material, but Ian Leslie aims the lens squarely at John and Paul and their friendship, their relationship, their creative partnership. He argues that their friendship, their creative partnership was extremely intimate, was as deep as a romance. It wasn't a sexual relationship, but it's one of those rare friendships that kind of blurs the boundaries of friendship and romance. And he looks at this idea through the songs that they performed and wrote together, and also the ones that they wrote in their solo careers, which were maybe kind of talking to each other in ways that they couldn't necessarily communicate in words. And yeah, he makes a really compelling argument for like just how deep their relationship was. It was often strained at times, especially in the post-Beatles years, but ultimately they were probably the most important people in each other's lives. I really appreciated that Ian Leslie retained John and Paul's rough edges. He didn't gloss over any of the more difficult aspects of their personalities. It's well known that John Lennon had a violent temper, which is rather at odds with his kind of peace and love persona. But yeah, he was violent. He was jealous and bitter and petty and cynical, and and also loving and warm. And yeah, he was a complex, complicated character, and Ian Leslie doesn't try and simplify him or boil him down. And, the same with Paul McCartney. Although Paul wasn't violent like John, he could be difficult and maybe sometimes a bit cold and distant. And they were both philanderers before they eventually each married the loves of their lives, and in John's case, kind of a little bit afterwards as well. But yeah, he Ian Leslie doesn't shy away from these difficult facts about these people, even though he clearly greatly admires them and their music. It's not a hagiography. Ian Leslie also makes a good argument for John and Paul being more similar in temperament and personality than the received wisdom would have us believe. And I think part of that is down to John Lennon himself trying to, in interviews that he gave in the post-Beatles years, he would paint Paul as the soppy balladeer and himself as the revolutionary artist. And in truth, they both contained both of those aspects. John could also be a soppy balladeer, and Paul could also be a revolutionary artist. In fact, Paul, rather than John, was the one who was, in the mid-60s, deeply immersed in the London art scene, exploring the avant-garde, not just art but music, and bringing that back to the rest of the band. And so I think a lot of the more experimental and unprecedented sounds that the Beatles created were actually probably more Paul's doing than John's, which probably made John a little bit jealous. I mean, it's not for nothing that John wrote a song in which he declares himself a jealous guy. I really like, actually, how Ian Leslie takes some of John and Paul's statements and behaviours and looks at them kind of... he divorces them from John and Paul's respective public images and describes quite well how images can be misleading. That because Paul was the kind of the soft-spoken, pretty one with big, rounded, pretty eyes, and John kind of looked a bit more pointy and his eyes were narrower because he was short-sighted, it meant that Paul actually got away with saying some things that, if John had said them, it would have caused a scandal. I mean, John famously caused a scandal by declaring in an interview that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, which he was saying in a kind of baffled way, not a boastful way. But in the very same interview, Paul McCartney made some quite strident declarations about his dislike of America and the racist policies of segregation that were in effect at the time. And that interview, all of it was printed in America, and the management was kind of worried that it was Paul's stuff that was going to cause offense to Americans, but no, it was John in the end. And part of that was, I think, down to their looks and their voices more than what they were actually saying. So I think this is a really insightful book, and one that doesn't take any of the legends for granted. I think it's actually Ian Leslie's first music book. His previous books have all been all about human behaviour. And I mean, this really is about human behaviour too. It's just the human behaviour of musicians. And yeah, I think it's really insightful and thoughtful and thought-provoking. And yeah, I think it's enhanced my appreciation and my understanding of the Beatles as people. Ultimately, this book is a portrait of a friendship, a creative partnership, and one that went deeper than perhaps a romance. And it's all told through the lens of the music that they made, either together or apart. And it's about it's about what these songs say about their feelings for one another, whether consciously or unconsciously. It includes a quote from a fairly recent interview with Paul McCartney in which he says, "Music is like a psychiatrist. You can tell your guitar things you can't tell people, and it will answer you with things people can't tell you." I also really like the way that Ian Leslie writes about music and about how it appeals to us as listeners. I think it's easy, it's simple to say that a song is about whatever the lyrics are about, but Ian Leslie rightly says that it's more than that. It's also about the pure power of the sound of the music. I particularly love this quote from the book. "Pop songs work on several different frequencies at once. Written down, they might suggest one story, but in sonic motion, they throw off meanings and feelings like sparks from a Catherine wheel, beyond the conscious intention of their creators. She Loves You vibrates with the glorious confusion of being young. The narrator presents himself as a detached and rational friend, but is more deeply invested in this triangular story than he knows. She loves you, secretly, wants you to notice how much I love you." And later he writes, "The deepest truth and greatest beauty of a Beatles song is found in Paul's bass, John's and George's guitars, Ringo's drumming, in the ensemble and the arrangements, in technological innovations and happy accidents, in the wash of sound achieved by Martin and his engineers, and in the grains of the Beatles' voices." I think that's a great distillation of the enduring appeal of the Beatles and the appeal of any music, really. Ultimately, it's not about just what the words say, it's about what the music says. And this is a book all about what music says, about what these songs that John and Paul wrote say about their enduring love and occasional hatred of each other. So, yeah, I think this is a wonderful, really accessible and interesting book. It's a pretty quick read. The chapters aren't dauntingly long, and yeah, if you're familiar with the songs already, I'm sure, as they were for me, they will be playing in your head as you read it. So that was my pick for People April, and thanks again to Vintage Stacie for recommending this book on her channel. I'm really glad that I read it, and yeah, I definitely recommend you check out her channel. I'd love to hear in the comments if you've read this book, or if you have any other Beatle book recommendations, or if you're a Beatles fan, let me know what your favourite Beatles album or song is, or whatever else is on your mind. I'm always happy to hear from you. Anyway, that's about it from me today. I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you when I see you. You'd say, I'm putting you on, but it's no joke. It's doing me hard, no, I can't sleep. I can't stop my brain, it's 3 weeks. You know what you say, I'll give you everything I've got for